Now to one journalist's story of making her life in Detroit. Amy Haimerl didn't set out to write a book, but she blogged about buying a house in Detroit for $35,000 and renovating it. But her story is much more than just the cliche of new residents moving from Brooklyn to Detroit, as she explains in Detroit Hustle, a memoir of love, life, and home. Amy and I met up to talk about her book on Mackinac Island.
Maybe when we first came, we were part of that cliche as well. You don't know what you don't know. But my husband and I did move to Detroit from Brooklyn. Part of it was because I got a fellowship at the University of Michigan. That was the first thing that brought us. And we decided to stay in Detroit. We were newlyweds, thinking about where did we want to live our life. And we fell in love with the people first. The warmth and the kindness and sort of this place that just really spoke to us as sort of figuring out what its future was going to be rather than resting on its laurels. And we liked that and the idea of being a part of a community. So the book is sort of about that, but it's also about what is home in the modern context, who is a local and who is a newcomer, issues of race and class and gentrification. How do you come into a place like Detroit, especially someone like me who grew up really poor in rural Colorado in an area where my family is now being gentrified out because million-dollar condos are going up and they don't like their working class muddy boots and rumbling trucks. So on the one side I talk about in the book being gentrified, and on the other side feeling like coming to Detroit with, white couple of some means because my husband had saved and we were able to have some opportunities in a city with 40% poverty. How do we do that? How do you do that delicately? How do you become a part of the community? Expect to contour to the place rather than expecting the place to contour to you. I always tell people you can't go somewhere just because it's cheaper and expect it to be just like home.
You know, and I think that's interesting that you make that point, because when we talk to people who are starting to come to Detroit and saying, I can be anything here, I can make this city anything I want to, I think that's a very interesting concept when you're talking about people who have been in a neighborhood and say, how do I fit into this place, instead of, I'm just going to make this place my own and start off something new.
Right, something it already exists. There are 700,000 people living, loving, and making their lives in Detroit. This isn't Star Trek. We're not boldly going where no one has gone before. We're going to a city that exists, that is a powerful, beautiful city that we came to because we loved it, not because we wanted to change it, but because we wanted to be a part of it. And I think growing up in the rural West, that's something that we experience a lot, is people coming to the West from California, from Texas, from around, because they love the mountains, they love the skiing, but they want it to be just like wherever they left, but with mountains, and that's very difficult for the locals there. So this has sort of been something I've experienced my entire life, and now I'm just on the other side of the conversation.
What I love about Detroit Hustle, though, it's not this like, look, we magically bought a house for cheap and we rehabbed it and now everything is fabulous. This journey that you took to rehabbing Matilda, you ended up naming the house.
My husband named it Matilda.
But talk to me about why you picked West Village neighborhood, how you fell in love with the house,
Sure.
and I think really the real journey, the tough journey, and the expensive one of making it home.
So when we started looking, we were looking in downtown and midtown and Corktown, the neighborhood sort of everybody knows about because we didn't know the city very well at all. So that's what felt comfortable. We weren't finding many properties that were actually habitable. If there was a house that was move-in ready, which, by any other city standards might not be, but it has running water, it has electricity. They were being snapped up, all cash sales, done in a day. You just couldn't get a hold of them. So we started expanding and looking at things. We looked at a number of sort of pretty bad, construction projects that were just beyond what we wanted to do. We thought we were going to do just like, let's redo the kitchen and, do some cosmetic improvements. And then we found Matilda. And she had no plumbing, no electrical, no heating,
no
windows, no doors. Like, she was basically just an empty shell. We were going to have to rebuild a house inside, not even 4 good walls, just 3, because the south wall was collapsing. But there was something about this house that we just connected with us. My husband will say, in the same way he knew I was the one, he knew this was the one for him. But more importantly, as soon as we came out of looking at the house for the first time, this guy comes walking across the street and he's like, hi, I'm Jim Boyle, and and so friendly. But his first question to us is, what's your intention? And it was very clear he was looking for neighbors who were going to come here, live and make their lives in this house to stay, not in just be an investor, because they'd been fighting a bad investor owner for a number of years. So we didn't know anything about the West Village. We just happened to luck into this amazing community. This house wasn't what we were thinking, this community wasn't what we were thinking, and yet somehow the universe pulled us to the most perfect place for my husband and I.
In your book, you're very frank about the cost
Yes.
of this and how much money that you actually
Yes.
spent rehabbing that home. Tell us.
So we spent $35,000 buying the house and almost $400,000 rehabbing it. We did not go in expecting to have to spend that much. What I tell everybody is the cost of rehab is about the same, plus or minus 10%, wherever you are in the country. So doing this in Denver, New York, Detroit, it doesn't really matter. That's the cost of labor, that's the cost of materials. Some people are DIY. Sadly, my husband and I are not. Despite my blue-collar roots, my parents are just like, what has happened to you? So we hired contractors who are amazing, and because I grew up in a contracting household, my dad was an excavator, I grew up believing wholeheartedly that you do it right the first time and you pay a fair wage. You want good quality at a fair price. You don't want cheap. So we got good quality at a fair price, but even $400,000 for a 3,000 square foot historic home, a historic restoration of a historic home, you know, it's a lot when people think about Detroit, but what does that say about our perceptions of Detroit and the worth of Detroit and what we're willing to invest? Still, it seems like a lot, but our housing costs are still lower than they were in Brooklyn. You know, so in the end, like we may have spent more than the house is actually worth to do it, but when our costs are lower for us each month, we're not trying to flip it. We're trying to live here, make our lives here. Those numbers don't really matter. What matters is, can you make your monthly cash flow?
And I think I want to get into a little bit more, just not about rehabbing the house, but when you started to feel like you were a part of the neighborhood, or how do you say, all right, this is where I'm going to make my home and this is where we want to be. How do you start to ingratiate yourself into a place that you're learning about without coming across as, well, here, we're here and we're new neighbors on the block and this is going to be our place now?
Right. So, I mean, we call it Matilda, but the neighborhood still calls it Nona's place because Nona and Arthur Herzog owned it for so long, and that's okay. You know, I'm from the rural West where places are still called, you know, Dick's Joint or the Haimerl's place, you know, 3 generations after the Haimerls actually owned it. So I feel like despite there being so little commonality between my hometown of Fruita and Detroit, culturally that prepared me for it. It's a small town. You go in, you wait, you sit, and whatever your third place is. For me, it's the bar stool at PJ's Lager House. Maybe it's a church. Maybe it's some other place, but just sitting there and being a part of that community, not stepping up and saying, oh, I have a million ideas to fix this and change this. But how do I just sit here and listen and volunteer if people need help and say, I'm willing to do whatever work you need, and just be a part of it rather than trying to suddenly come in and lead a change of it.
Yeah, Amy's book is very interesting, but it does also touch on this thought of, you know, people who can come in and rehab a house. I mean, not everyone has that kind of capital to be able to do that, and some of these houses are in such, you know, such disrepair.
Yeah, well, and you got to be careful. She has to be careful, and I should say, we disclosed that I blurbed the book. I read it and really loved the narrative and the story. I'm worried for her. I'm worried for someone I know being in that kind of financial position, borrowing so much to do that in Detroit. I think there are ways for us to improve properties and bring them back to livability in Detroit without going to that extreme, and that's her choice, right?
But also the story of people who have that interest in Detroit, and you know, it's not always the very easy thing, and also making your way through a neighborhood and you know, learning to be part of a community without bulldozing your way through it.
Well, it's also, I mean, it's also not a neighborhood that was blighted too much. I mean, it's a stable area of the city, and so she's helped made it more stable.
Yeah, thanks to Amy for sharing her story with us. That's going to do it for My Week. Thanks so much for joining us. Keep up with the show, myweek.org, and on Facebook and on Twitter. We will be back next Thursday. I'm Christy McDonald. We'll see you then.